October 14th, 2025, South Iris Street, Alexandria, Virginia. A quiet residential neighborhood. The kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked in the afternoon and kids run around outside until well after dark without their parents worrying. But that night was Halloween, and that night, one family lived through the 10 most terrifying minutes of their lives. Not because of a stranger, not because of a gang, but because of people they called family. Shayla Whiteside was home with her mother, a woman who had recently lost her husband, still deep in grief, along with her younger brother and the family dog. No man in the house. No one to fall back on if something went wrong. Then the doorbell rang. Shayla opened her Ring camera app, and she saw them. 3 figures standing on the front porch under the dim orange light of the night. A white-faced clown with a grin twisted into something horrifying. A Michael Myers killer in a blank, expressionless white mask. And a pitch-black evil nun from head to toe. All 3 staring directly into the lens, as if they knew exactly that she was watching from the other side. And then they started screaming. "We are your worst nightmare. Open this damn door right now." Shayla froze. Her heart, as she would later tell reporters, felt like it had dropped out of her chest. At first, she tried to stay calm. She spoke into the camera and said, "Happy Halloween." She thought maybe it was neighborhood kids running late or someone's friends pulling a prank. But they weren't joking. No laughter, no boo like you'd expect from a harmless Halloween gag. No sign whatsoever that this was anything other than what it looked like. A threat. One of them pressed their mask right up against the camera lens and yelled, "It's either you coming out or we coming in. Your choice." That was the moment Shayla understood. This was not a prank. This was a direct threat to her life, and she could not recognize a single face behind those masks. 9:51 p.m. Shayla announced through the camera speaker that she had called 911 and police were on their way. Under normal circumstances, that statement alone would be enough to make any rational person back off and leave, but these 3 didn't retreat. They escalated. The doorbell kept ringing without stop. Then the pounding began. Not a knock, but a full force beating against the door like they were trying to break it down. The sound of the door handle being twisted and yanked and shoved, and threaded through all of it, voices screaming into the microphone. "You're not getting away! We know where you live! Open up or we're coming in!" Shayla was in full panic. She called her brother, who wasn't home at the time, and begged him to come immediately. He heard the terror in her voice, asked nothing, jumped in his car and floored it. He brought his gun. 9:57 p.m. The group realized the front door wasn't going to break, but they didn't give up. They moved around to the back of the house. The backyard fence was smashed down. The screen on the back porch was torn apart by hand. The glass window shook from hard, repeated blows, and one of them shouted that they were going to grab a chair outside and use it to smash the window open. This was the moment the illusion of home as a safe place completely shattered. Shayla would later tell reporters that it wasn't herself she was most afraid for in that moment. It was her mother, a woman who had just lost her husband, who was sitting inside shaking, who had already been through more than enough, because her mother couldn't take another blow. Not like this. Not now. Around 10 p.m., the 3 masked figures suddenly stopped. They stepped out of the camera's view, and then they were gone. Outside, captured on footage from neighboring security cameras that police would later collect, the 3 of them walked out from behind the house, calmly removed their Halloween masks, got into a car that had been waiting for them, and drove away. Casual, like they'd just wrapped up a rehearsal. Inside, Shayla and her family stayed barricaded in the dark, waiting for police, waiting for her brother to arrive with his gun. They didn't know the danger had passed. They didn't know the figures were gone. And they had absolutely no idea that everything that had just happened was a prank, orchestrated by their own relatives. Alexandria Police Department, APD, deployed that same night. Multiple patrol officers, canine units, crime scene investigators, and the Criminal Investigations Division all responded to the 100 block of South Iris. They secured the perimeter, swept every dark corner of the surrounding area, collected physical evidence from the destroyed fence and porch, and extracted raw footage from the Ring camera. Police Chief Tarrick McGuire personally held a press conference and declared this a very serious matter, pledging that his department would work tirelessly to unmask, his word, whoever had terrorized this family, and make sure people could walk the streets without living in fear. He then made a move that proved decisive. He asked every resident in the area around Duke and South Jordan Streets to review their own home security camera footage between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. that night, and to upload anything suspicious directly to a public evidence portal APD had set up specifically for this case. Instead of relying solely on traditional detective work, they turned the entire neighborhood into a network of witnesses. And it worked. Over 100 hours of investigation, dozens of video clips analyzed frame by frame. Then a critical tip came in from the community following that first press conference. That tip led to 3 teenagers, aged 14 to 16, and as detectives began tracing those teenagers back to their source, they couldn't believe what they were finding. These 3 were not strangers. They were the sons and nephew of a cousin of the victim's family. They were blood relatives, and when police knocked on the door of the family involved, a woman confessed to everything. She admitted that she, along with her 2 sons, her nephew, and at least 2 other adults had driven from Fairfax County to Alexandria specifically to set up the whole incident, as a prank, as a Halloween surprise for their relatives. And while the 3 teenagers were pounding on the door, screaming into the camera, tearing apart the fence, and threatening to kill the people inside, the adults who had brought them there sat in the car or stood at a distance and filmed the whole thing on their phones. That detail is what takes this case beyond a story about reckless teenagers and turns it into something that has to be talked about. Because the adults in that car were not bystanders. They were architects. They drove the kids there. They planned the route. They chose the timing. They knew what was going to happen. And instead of stopping it at any point, instead of saying, "This has gone too far, let's go," they held up their cameras. Because in their minds, the terror on the other side of that door was content. The psychological collapse of a grieving widow was entertainment. Something to record. Something to replay. Something to laugh at later. That level of detachment from basic human empathy is not a prank gone wrong. It is a moral failure at its most fundamental. Now, here's the part of the story that should make everyone's blood run cold. Shayla's brother arrived at the scene with a loaded gun. He had received a frantic call from his sister saying people were trying to break into their home and kill their family. He came to protect them. And if he had arrived just 3 minutes earlier, if he had pulled up to that house while 3 people in killer masks were still smashing the backyard fence and screaming in the dark, there is zero chance he would have recognized his own cousins under those masks. Zero. He would have seen 3 masked attackers in the dark threatening his family. Under Virginia's castle doctrine, under the Second Amendment protections that Shayla herself referenced in her interview. A decision to shoot in that scenario would almost certainly have been ruled justified self-defense. The family would have survived the night only to discover they had shot their own relatives. Shayla put it plainly when she spoke to the press. Our Second Amendment rights were not used, but they absolutely could have been. That sentence lands like ice water. Under Virginia law, the behavior of this group, approaching a private residence, issuing violent death threats, attempting to force entry, destroying physical property including a fence, a porch screen, and a window frame, fully satisfies the elements required for charges including attempted burglary, making criminal threats, and vandalism. The fact that the perpetrators claimed it was just a prank is legally irrelevant. The law assesses situations from the perspective of the victim at the time they occurred, not from the explanation offered after arrest. From Shayla's perspective that night, this was a lethal threat with clear intent to breach her home. No reasonable person in her position would have concluded otherwise. Yet, despite all of that, Shayla ultimately asked police not to pursue criminal charges against her relatives because they were family, and no matter how deeply she was hurt, she could not bring herself to put them in front of a judge. The case was closed without a single charge filed. The identities of the teenagers and the adults involved were never made public, but Chief McGuire refused to let the silence speak for the department. In his closing statement, he used 4 precise words to frame everything: a moral failure. He said that even without criminal prosecution, what happened that night represented, in his words, a moral failure, one whose consequences could have been deadly. And the word "could" in that sentence deserves attention, because it does an enormous amount of work. It could have been deadly. It was not by a margin of approximately 3 minutes and the timing of one car's arrival. That is the only reason this story ends where it does and not in a morgue. The adults who planned this, who drove those teenagers across county lines to carry it out, who stood outside filming while a widowed mother shook with terror inside. They walked away. No handcuffs, no courtroom, no public record. Nothing but a police chief's press conference calling them what they are. And Shayla's mother, the woman who had already lost her husband, who had been trying to hold the pieces of her life together, now cannot bring herself to stay alone in that house anymore. The home that was supposed to be her last safe place, the place that held the memories of the man she lost, has become a space filled with dread. That is the real price of this prank. Not the broken fence, not the torn screen, but a grieving woman who no longer feels safe inside her own walls. No verdict restores that. No apology undoes that. And 3 teenagers will grow up having learned, from the adults who were supposed to guide them, that someone else's fear is a spectacle worth filming. This case is one of the clearest examples of something that is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In a culture that has normalized shock content, that rewards the most extreme reactions, that treats other people's pain as raw material for entertainment, the line between a joke and a crime is being erased deliberately and casually by people who should know better. Halloween masks and a doorbell camera. That's all it took to bring a family to the edge of a tragedy they would never have recovered from. And the only thing standing between that night and something irreversible was 3 minutes and a stroke of timing that nobody